it is exactly 2:15 in Eastern time zone and 9:15 in Efrat, the Israeli time zone. And welcome back to Laurie. We'll get back with after our sort of, I wouldn't call it a break, but the Hanukkah back on pure woman halachic issues. And today on Mechitza, which I was talking to Laurie earlier today, and the Mechitza was the defining issue, for better or for worse. It was the defining issue of Orthodoxy in the 50s and the 60s, just like the organ in Germany became the defining issue. Different issues become, for all kinds of reasons, well beyond halakha, sociological, halachic reasons. And what Laurie just asked me to present very briefly, I'll really let you present it, is just Rabbi Soloveitchik, who, well, there, on the one hand, was very strongly in favor of mechitza. On the other hand, told many rabbis to go to shuls. Sorry about that. Told many rabbis to go to shuls without mechitzot. There's a letter in the book by Nati Helfgott on the Rav's letters, a fascinating letter that the Rav wrote to the president of the conservative shul in Boston. Rabbi Soloveitchik was very good friends with Rabbi Shubau, who was a conservative rabbi in Boston. And on the 25th anniversary of his rabbinate in the shul, they invited the Rav to be a guest speaker. And the Rav wrote an amazing letter that I'll let Laurie talk about. She wanted me to mention it, just sort of by way of introduction. There's the halachic aspects of the mechitza, and then there are the sociological, historical. So I think I went on too long, Laurie, but I think I'm following your instructions. Vakasha, I'll let you take over.
Not at all. It's fascinating. It's an amazing thing that there are so many. If it's hard to put ourselves back in time sometimes, and definitely some of you are more familiar with what was then than I. But if you think about it, so Rav Soloveitchik, the kind of the leader of modern Orthodoxy in America, is being invited to a ceremony to celebrate a conservative rabbi in the area with whom he has a very cordial relationship. And he needs to explain why he's not going to go into the conservative shul for this event. And the truth of the matter is, if you think that, it's clearly a very sensitive situation. And Rav Soloveitchik, of course, is known for his great sensitivity in dealing with communal issues. That's what this whole book, edited by Rav Nati Helfgott, is about. He didn't really need to mention the mechitza at all, if you think about it, right? In other words, if he needs to say ultimately, I'm Orthodox rabbi, one of the top Orthodox rabbis in the country, I can't be going to an event in a conservative shul, that would, in theory, that would kind of do it. But that's not actually what happens. What he writes is, this does not, and he starts by talking about how much regret he has and how much he honors the rabbi. And then he says, yet all this does not justify my serving as a sponsor of a dinner at which the dedication of this temple will be celebrated, since the latter will, in all probability, have a mixed seating arrangement, which is, in my opinion, not in consonance with our time-honored law. The requirement for separate pews is almost a truism in our religious code, and I have neither the right nor the desire to sanction, either by word or by silence, a departure from this tradition. My presence at the celebration or the appearance of my name as a sponsor would be tantamount to a tacit approval of mixed pews, of things which would greatly disturb my conscience. In other words, what's amazing to me here is that, and I think this is what Rabbi Jay was starting to get at, in our day, we would have thought that the statement would be, my presence at a conservative shul as an Orthodox rabbi might be complicated for me. That might be what he would have said. But the way that was said in that time, let me just get the exact date again. The date is 1954. The way you said that in 1954 was by saying, I can't go to a shul with mixed seating. You didn't say I can't go to a conservative shul, you'd say I can't go to a shul with mixed seating. And it's sort of like, how did mixed seating become the thing that represented the difference between an Orthodox shul and not an Orthodox shul? So in terms of structure, we could talk about how the building is put together, and yet that doesn't really fully answer the question. What I want to do, we have, Bezrat Hashem, we're going to have 2 sessions talking about mechitza. There's a possibility we'll go into a third if we decide that we really want to talk about mechitza outside of the shul context, but we'll see. where we are with that. But in the 2 sessions that at the moment are what I'm envisioning, I want to talk about 2 things. I want to talk about what the mechitza is actually doing, why we need it, what it's for, which is actually a little less obvious than you might think. And only following that, Bezrat Hashem, next week, I want to talk about how the mechitza is made. The reason being that you can't really understand the ins and outs of how it should be made without understanding what it's supposed to accomplish, right? The same way that you wouldn't try to analyze, they made some big public library in New York, and then they discovered that it wasn't handicapped accessible or something like that. You wouldn't try to analyze the success of a building until you understood what the functions were that it was trying to serve and whether or not it served the function. So if the building is supposed to be for an entire neighborhood, if it's not handicapped accessible, let's say, for example, then it's not necessarily fulfilling its function. So too mechitza. Before we can really talk about how the mechitza is done, or even how we conduct ourselves around the mechitza, or where we need the mechitza, we have to first really understand what the mechitza is for. And in a sense, the shiur is actually much harder to give than a lot of other shiurim, because on the one hand, we could talk about separate. I'm hoping we're going to talk about, correct. Someone just on the chat, and I'm not supposed to look, but I did. We're going to need to distinguish to the extent possible between a need for separate seating and a need for a mechitza, an actual physical structural division. They're not the same thing, right? But what I was starting to say is that this is a particularly challenging topic to teach. I have sources. We're going to look at plenty of sources, but the truth of the matter is that there really aren't a huge amount of sources of the sort that we might have expected to see. Given that, if you get back to the point about Rav Soloveitchik, given that this becomes such a central way in which we're defining the synagogue, we might have thought that we would find a direct discussion of how a mechitza functions in the synagogue in the Talmud. And we might have thought that we would find, let's say, a siman in Shulchan Aruch about how you build a mechitza in your shul, and we don't. Now, the fact that something isn't there doesn't mean it's not important, right? Sometimes some of the things that are most essential or most important don't get written down because they're so obvious, but it's still, it poses a certain challenge here, because what we're doing on some level is trying to reconstruct the halachic or source-based history of something where there's a lot missing. And that's tricky, and we're going to have to understand what the implications are for that for our topic. Okay, without further ado, let's share the screen and let's see these sources that have already played up as not necessarily being everything, but they're pretty interesting. So don't worry, there's stuff to work with here, and I think we'll get somewhere. Okay, good. This is just going to take me a second to get my window where I want it to be. Please bear with me for a moment. Okay, and I want to start with Shirat Hayam. It's funny how when you can read something 1,000,001 times, but when you're actually looking for something, it appears a little differently to you. So in this case, if you're looking for examples of not specifically necessarily a mechitza, but for gender separation, Shirat Hayam is an interesting precedent. We know that Moshe Rabbeinu starts singing, right? Az yashir Moshe b'nei Yisrael et hashira zot l'Hashem. This is when Moshe and Bnei Israel are singing this song to God. But then, Vatikach Miriam Hanaviyah Achot Aaron, Miriam, the prophetess, the sister of Aaron, takes et hatof biyada, the drum or cymbal or timbrel or whatever it is in her hand, Vatetzena kol hanashim achareh b'tufiv u'mcholot, and all the women follow her, also with their timbrels and with dancing. And what's here actually, it's actually even explicit, but it's not the kind of thing you necessarily think about in this context, is it doesn't look like they were celebrating all together. Meaning there's a sense in which they're celebrating all together, it's the people Israel, but the women are actually singing and dancing separately, Vatan lehem Miriam shir l'Hashem ki goga. And Miriam says to them, there's actually a lot of discussion in the a lot of discussion about why it says them here in it with a mem sofit instead of a nun sofit, because it is widely understood, especially from context, that she's singing specifically to the women. That's its own discussion. But what we have here is the women are going out to dance separately, it seems like, from the men. And the occasion is one, again, if we think a little broadly about it, Shirat Hayam isn't just a regular song and dance. We were talking about Hallel last week. It's kind of like the predecessor to Hallel. It's a tefillah. It's a Shira Hazot Lashem. It's a song to God. So this is a biblical example of a song being sung to God in the presence of the people, and men and women are also physically, it appears, separate. Not specifically, we don't see here anything about a physical divider. It's just that the women are following Miriam. And it's clear that it's specifically the women who are following Miriam. And it's an interesting precedent. We have another precedent too. I see, I'm not going to open up the chats now. I'm going to leave that to the end, but I see that they're there and I look forward to having some question time a little later. There's another example, if we think about it, from Shmot, from Ma'amad Har Sinai. So as a prelude to Ma'amad Har Sinai, God says that men and women have to separate, they can't have relations. This has to do with the impurity conveyed by semen. It's actually interesting, it's not just the men, it's also that the women following relations at some point would have seminal discharge. And that would also affect the women's purity leading up to being able to hear the revelation at Sinai. And perhaps drawing from that as a model, in Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, Rav Pinchas says, Erev Shabbat Amdu Yisrael B'Har Sinai. We always say that Matan Torah is on a Friday. They stood at Har Sinai on Friday. Orchin ha'anashim levad v'anashim levad. This midrash says that when they were at Har Sinai, the men and the women actually arranged themselves to be separate. Now, Ma'amad Har Sinai, in fairness, is not a prayer, but it has something in common with prayer. The fundamental aspect of prayer, after all, is an awareness and intentionality that we're standing before God. So the ultimate model for standing before God is Ma'amad Har Sinai. And here we have a midrash that's telling us that Ma'amad Har Sinai, not just in the preparation for it, but also at Sinai itself, when God is giving over the Torah, at that moment, the men and the women have separated themselves. Now, there's no indication here that they were commanded to continue to be separate, even at Ma'amad Har Sinai. It seems that they understood that this was what they needed to do. But if we understand this is another model of prayer, then that's potentially, very telling in terms of what we should do. Why else? What else might be relevant? Well, I brought here, this is a Mishnah from Brachot. Mishnah from Brachot is starting already to get into something a little bit more about the why. We talked a little bit about models for what, and the question is still why. And Mishnah is talking about what situation should we be in, what should be our mode when we enter into prayer, our mental mode. Mishnah, Einom dim palel ela mitoch koved rosh. We should only stand for prayer from within a stance, from within a mindset of seriousness. I don't know if this is done with or without a mechitza, actually, in many shuls. That's a separate discussion. Amar of Nachman bar Yitzchak nehacha. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak proves this from Pasuk in Tehillim. Ivdur et Hashem b'yira v'gilu bir'ada. We should serve God with awe, and we should rejoice in trembling, which is in itself a really kind of complex emotion, right? There's a way in which that moment with God is the rejoicing at the Song of the Sea, and that moment with God is also the trembling standing at Sinai. They're both happening at the same time when we come to pray, and that's the ideal. The ideal is something that we call koved rosh, seriousness. And the opposite of that, or converse, is what we shouldn't be doing. Tanu Rabbanan, Einon dimli palel lo mitoch atzlut. You shouldn't go into prayer sad. Velo mitoch atzlut. and not from idleness, velo mitoch schok, and not from silliness or levity, velo mitoch sicha, and not from conversation. I don't know how many people accomplish this, not conversing right before tefillah, velo mitoch kalut rosh. Okay, this is going to be the phrase that we're going to see again and again. There's an idea that prayer, we just saw two complementary sources, which come pretty close to each other in the Gemara. The one is that the ideal for entering into prayer is a mental mode of koved rosh, a sense of seriousness. Even if you were being frivolous a minute ago, there's supposed to be a moment where you kind of pull yourself together to stand before God, understanding what that means. And the flip side of that is you're not supposed to have kalut rosh or frivolity. Now, kalut rosh can also sometimes have overtones that are a little bit sexual. Frivolity can sometimes also connect the phrases about something like sexuality. So, for example, we see here, Rabbi Akiva said, "Schok v'kalut rosh margilin le'erva." Rabbi Akiva said that people who engage too often in levity and frivolity or frivolousness, kalut rosh, these are people who will become accustomed to sexual impropriety. And the Gemara says that batei knesiot ein noagim bein kalut rosh. Again, just as it's not appropriate for prayer, even outside of the prayer context, ideally kalut rosh is not going to be what we experience in shul. So in terms of a first stab at what's going on with mechitza or with gender separation in the synagogue, a first stab at what's going on is that we have a model that we've seen in Shirat Hayam and that we've seen at Ma'amad Har Sinai, and this model is somehow meant to help us keep in a mode of koved rosh, where kalut rosh, frivolity, is associated with sexual impropriety, and it's also associated, or it's something that's seen as potentially promoting it, has to do with some interaction between the sexes. Now, I should point out here, and we'll see more about this later, that this is that saying that in and of itself is a little charged nowadays. It's charged nowadays. First of all, everything else aside, we know that it's not necessarily always the case that keeping men and women separate is going to be enough to preserve the right atmosphere in prayer. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it, that it can't help promote it, but that it's not necessarily enough. And additionally, we have the complication that I think we're more aware now than ever, that leaving aside the question of what halacha has to say about it, there are people who are attracted to the same gender within a gender group, and that means that separating between genders doesn't necessarily totally knock out even sexual types of kalut rosh. And additionally, I'll also throw out that we're living in a time where binary conceptions of gender are also being challenged, so that a lot of the things that halacha is taking, I wouldn't necessarily even say it's taking for granted, but the perspective from halacha is really based on a perspective of primarily dealing with men and women, though of course our halachic system is aware, we've talked about this previously, I think in question times, is aware that there can be people in between. But our halacha is taking the perspective that there are men, there are women, they can be separated, and that in and of itself will have an effect on kalut rosh, and does not seem to be particularly preoccupied with the possibility of, let's say, kalut rosh within the gender group in the sexual vein. At least not explicitly. We're not seeing that in traditional sources. Did someone ask a question, or did someone doesn't have mute on? Okay, I think it's someone just doesn't have mute on. Okay. What about what happened exactly in Beit HaMikdash? So it's interesting. One of the examples that we look to for sources for this is Beit HaMikdash. And there's this kind of suggestive phrase in Kiddushin, Isha be'azara minayin. How would it ever come to be that a woman would find herself in the temple courtyard? Now, the temple was designed, there's a few different levels of courtyards within the temple as you slowly make your way towards the inner sanctum. there's something called Ezrat Nashim. Now, the Ezrat Nashim in the temple, that's the first time, or the woman's courtyard in the temple, which is the first time that we know that phrase. We've kind of adapted it or adopted it for the shul. The Ezrat Nashim was actually a place where men could be as well. But it was called the Ezrat Nashim because that was more or less as far as women usually went in the vicinity of the temple. Generally speaking, Isha Bazar Minayin, generally speaking, women weren't going inside to the Azara, Ezrat Yisrael. They weren't going another step in. However, sometimes they would. In what cases? Well, sometimes there would be cases where you had a halachic obligation to go inside. Let's say the Sota ritual. This is Tosfot Arush in Kedushin. He talks about the Sota ritual, or what if a woman can be a Nazir, right? There's such a thing as a Nazirah. She's ending her vow, her Nazirite vow. She's got to go in. So there are actually some cases in which a woman would need to go in. But what the Rush says is like this. He says, it's not prohibited for the woman to go in further. And nevertheless, the Gemara says, when the Gemara says that women, generally speaking, aren't in the Azara, that makes sense. Because it's not common that women would go into the Azara except if it would be necessary. And he's saying, and that's similar to what we know in shuls and in Batei Midrash. So the Rosh is also making the connection between Beit HaMikdash and the synagogue. And he's making the connection. He's saying, look, the Azara, it's a place where a woman in theory could go in some specific scenarios. It's not totally usher for her to be there at all times. And yet, that's not really where women are. Okay. Still, we're wondering where this gets us in terms of the shul. Now, it's actually interesting. I should throw in, we're not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I should just throw in that actually the way things were structured is that there were, that Ezrat Nashim was separated from the Azara by 15 steps. They weren't, it wasn't that they were just smooth and straight and right next to each other. There was some level of separation. And when women went in, there was something actually called, the Mishnah refers to something as Sha'ar Hanashim. Sha'ar Hanashim literally means the gate of the women. Tiferet Yisrael explains, when a woman would need to stand over her sacrifice, and that would be a reason she would go toward the Azara inside, she would go to the Sha'ar Nashim. So it's interesting. On the one hand, the courtyard in some cases would be open to women, even though it would be, generally speaking, as necessary and fairly unusual. This courtyard is set aside from where the women usually are by 15 steps. And yet, when women go in, there's like a special place they go in from. So it's a space that men are in too, right? And also the Ezrat Nashim is a space that men are into. And yet the transition between the spaces is actually separated by gender. So you have a kind of interesting interplay going on in the Beit HaMikdash itself, which is you have this inner area that's mostly men, but sometimes women can go into. And even though once they're in there, it's going to be men, they're going in specifically being funneled as women. And there's a structural distinction also. So it's not hard and fast, but it's a form of separation. All right, finally, we're moving into what kind of gets treated as the main source for mechitza, and this is also from Beit HaMikdash. Tanu Rabbanan, our rabbis taught in a Braita. Barishona hayu nashimi bifnim v'anashimi b'chutz. Originally, women were on the inside and men were on the outside. What are we talking about? We're talking here about Simchat Beit HaShoeva, the festival of the water drawing on Sukkot. The festival of the water drawing on Sukkot, originally the way they would set it up, and we're talking here, by the way, about the Ezrat Nashim. Within the Ezrat Nashim, the women would be closer to the action, and the men would be farther back, or even maybe even outside the Ezrat Nashim. Okay, but the women would be closer in, the men would be behind. But hayu ba'im lidei kalut rosh. they came to, this is, those are the words that keep coming up, this idea of kalut rosh. Something actually happened. What's important here is it's not just in theory. Up till now, we've been seeing taken precautions because we're worried that it might happen. Here it actually did happen. Men and women were separate in terms of how they were standing, but there still was kalut rosh. Okay, what do you do? So our sages enacted that women would be back and men would be in front. I guess the idea was if women were in front and men were in back, this is, I guess, like resonates a little bit with some of the modern bus arguments with separate buses. Are the women in front or the women in back in Israel, which is pretty controversial. If they're going to be separate, who's in front and who's in back? So it looks like they tried first having the women in back, even just on a pure height level, that makes sense. I'm sorry, they tried first women in front. Women tend to be shorter than men. It seems to make sense if people want to see what's going on. That didn't work. Maybe the men were looking at the women before they were looking at the action of Simchat Beit HaShoeva. So then they switched it. The men were in front and the women were in back. And Adayin Hayu Bayin Lidei Kalut Rosh. Didn't work. It still wasn't enough. So you had physical separation, but no structure between them, and it didn't work. And then Hitkinu Shihu Nashim Yoshvot Milamala Vanashim Milamata. And that's when they said, okay, we're making a balcony. The women are going up and the men are going to be down. So I want to just think about this for a minute because it's fascinating to me. You had a situation in the outskirts of Beit HaMikdash. First of all, it's a huge celebration, not what we usually, the Beit HaMikdash was festive, right? It was where you came for holidays. There was singing of the Levim on a regular basis, but Simchat Beit HaShoeva took this to a whole other level. So you have the major Jewish blowout of the year is happening at Beit HaMikdash. And men and women are attending. And originally, the way this was done was to give women the front seat. And it didn't work. There was actually sin that resulted. Now, a possible response to that situation might have been to say something like, okay, we can't have men and women both at this event. Not going to work. And that's not what's done, right? What's done instead is saying we're going to put the men in front and the women in back. And then that also doesn't work. And again, a possible response would be to say, forget it, it's not going to work. Keep the women home. Still not what's done. They have the women on top and the men below. In other words, what's really important to understand from this source, or what I find personally fascinating about this source, is how hard the sages were working to try to ensure that women would be able to attend and men would be able to attend at the same time. That they kept trying different solutions rather than, they did not wash their hands or say, well, you're expendable. They didn't say it to men and they didn't say it to women. They said, we want you all here. It's just a question of how we can have you appropriately separate. And there's a process of trial and error till they figure it out. But the overarching goal of the structural change is actually not to distance anybody from the action. The goal of the structural change is inclusiveness, to include everybody in the action while still trying to maintain the appropriate atmosphere. Now, it's not trivially simple that they could do this because the plans for Beit HaMikdash are not really human plans. We understand that God is really responsible for the design of Beit HaMikdash, Nevuah. And it says that in Divrei Yamim, it says, Hakol bichtav miyad Hashem. That it's as if the whole plans for Beit HaMikdash are coming straight from God. So the question is, how did they have the chutzpah to build this balcony? Meaning, okay, you want to be inclusive, but it's sort of like, if you had this is taking it to many degrees further, but I don't know, you have like even in our modern day, I'm trying to think of the Taj Mahal. If someone says, I want another 20,000 people to be able to go to my festival at the Taj Mahal, so I'm gonna create a new parapet. outside the Taj Mahal to enable thousands more people to come. So people would be up in arms. It's a landmark. How can you touch it? How can you change the structure? This is Beit HaMikdash. And it's more serious than that, because it's not just Taj Mahal that it's clearly a human architect. There's divine input into how this is built. And yet, for the sake of inclusion, of having men and women be able to attend, there's a structural change. But they still have to defend what gave them the right to do that. Amarav, Kra Ashkachu V'Dorosh. Well, they found a pasuk, and they expounded from that pasuk, and that's what gave them the right to construct these balconies in Beit HaMikdash courtyard. V'safta ha'aretz mishpachot levad. Mishpachat Beit David levad, Nishem levad. This is an interesting pasuk from Zechariah. Zechariah is talking about some kind of great mourning that is going to happen in the days to come. There's a question about who's mourning for whom. Is it Mashiach ben Yosef who's being mourned? Is it the Yetzer Hara that's being mourned? What has disappeared? But whatever has disappeared, whatever it is that we are bereaved of, that we are mourning, he says, Mishpachat Beit David levad, the house of David to themselves, Unshehem levad, the men and the women, separate in the time of mourning. And the Gemara learns from this. Amru, they said, Halo dvarim kal v'chomer, can't we expound from this? A fortiori, in the future, when they're occupied with this eulogizing and there's no Yetzer Hara because they're in mourning, Amra Torah nashim levad, nashim levad. The Torah says men and women separate. Now, when we're talking about Simchas Beis HaShoeva, and there is a strong Yetzer Hara, a strong evil inclination to kalut rosh, for frivolity between the sexes, how much more so? In other words, we have the structure. We're not supposed to mess with it. We do want to be able to include men and women at Simchat Beit HaShoeva without kalut rosh. But we have a pasuk which indicates that even at this time of mourning, there was a separation. How much more so that we are justified, or perhaps, and this is what it really seems to be saying, that we are mandated to make a separation at a time of simcha. And it would have to be, it seems, a mandate, because otherwise, how could we override in any way, shape, or form Hakol Bichtav Miyad Hashem, a blueprint that was given from God? Again, we're in a little bit of a dicey territory here, because this is, in the one hand, it seems very relevant. This Kal V'chomer could apply in theory to a lot of situations. If in mourning they have to be separate, how much more so in all kinds of situations we would have to be separate when there's more of a tendency to Yetzer Hara. And yet, it's not talking about the synagogue, right? It's talking about Beit HaMikdash, and it's not even talking about Beit HaMikdash all the time. It's talking about Beit HaMikdash in a specific scenario. The connection to the synagogue has to do with another Gemara in Masechet Megillah that tells us a foundation about what a synagogue is. So Masechet Megillah says, takes a pasuk, Ahi lahem lemikdash ma'at, I will be for them like a small temple. What does that mean? Amar of Yitzchak, Elu batei knesiot batei midrashot shebabavel. There's an understanding, an idea that the synagogue is on the model of the temple. Can we really expound that way? Rav Kook does. Says, according to the Talmud, synagogues are to be looked upon as sacred temples in miniature. It is therefore our duty to exalt them to the same level of holiness as our temple. Indeed, our fathers, in establishing two separate divisions for men and women in the house of prayer, continued the system inaugurated in the temple. So what do we have? We have these big biblical moments, Shirat Hayam, Ma'amad Har Sinai, separation. We have Beit HaMikdash, where there actually was a fair degree of mixing, but it was contained. And there were key junctures at which it was clear where a woman could go or where a woman couldn't go. We have this story of Beit HaMikdash at the time of Simchat Beit HaShoeva, at this very festive time, where a lot of effort was made to ensure that the Avodat Hashem and the Simcha would be conducted with Koved Rosh, or at least without Kalut Rosh, and to the point that a structure is made in the temple. And implicitly, we're saying that there is some kind of imperative based on a pasuk in Zechariah that men and women be separated in some kind of event. And it's not even clear exactly what kind of event. And we're told that the synagogue follows the model of Beit Mikdash. So we can connect the dots. Like there's enough here to connect the dots. At the same time, it's just, in all honesty, it's not a simple, straightforward argument. The material is here. It's enough to give us a strong reason why we would want to be careful about this in the synagogue. But it's not totally simple. It's also not totally simple, I think, intuitively. It's a question, and gets back to Rav Soloveitchik a little bit. Back to the arguments about the sanctity of the synagogue was the book that kind of really brought a lot of these disagreements from the 50s, when the Mechitza was the flashpoint issue, to a head. And in those essays, we see an attempt to explain why this matters so much, why this is such an essential component of how Jews pray. And because we don't have a vast amount of sources that lay out exactly how this should be done in a synagogue, presumably to a large extent because there's continuity from generation to generation, synagogue to synagogue. They knew what needed to be done. You could say almost similarly, I don't think there are a lot of makorot about the specifics of the structure of the synagogue inside. This discussion, okay, maybe the bima has to be in the middle, or that kind of a thing, but there's room to play, and it's understood that people know what to do based on what's come in the past. There's still this question of clarifying what really is so important about it. Why can't, in those days, what people wanted, for example, they wanted to be with their families when they davened. So I'm lucky, for example, I have two daughters. So when I go to shul, which actually in Corona doesn't happen quite the way it once did, when I go to shul, I have people with me. But if I didn't have daughters, and I know many women who don't have children at all even, they don't have their family with them to daven. And there is a bit of a question about why that's for. Now, Rav Soloveitchik says as follows. He says, prayer means communion with the master of the world, and therefore withdrawal from all and everything. The presence of women among men, or of men among women, which often evokes a certain frivolity in the group, either in spirit or in behavior, can contribute little to sanctification or to the deepening of religious feeling, nor can it help instill that mood in which a man must be immersed when he would communicate with the Almighty. It's interesting what he's saying. He's saying the prayer is communion with the master of the world. Of course, when we come into a synagogue to pray, we're looking for a communal experience. But even though we're looking for a communal experience in general, he's saying existentially, fundamentally, it's us and God as individuals. I'm an individual, but I'm in the context of kind of like a vague community. It's not really I, let's say, and my daughter communicating with God. My daughter might be next to me, or my son might be over there, but it's really me and God. And for everyone in the synagogue, it's them and God, even though the whole community is there. But I think what he's saying is something else also, which is that part of what we're concerned is of course, this issue of Kalut Rosh. But part of what he's saying we're trying to do is to make the synagogue different from the social. Where the goal seems to be that he wants to instill a mood. He's looking for sanctification. And it seems that there's something about the disconnect, the change of being in a synagogue and being separated by gender, as opposed to, for many of us, going through our lives not separated, which helps us understand that we're entering into a different space. When we talk about rituals, a lot of times when people study ritual, they talk about liminality. They talk about kind of an entrance into a ritual mode. There's something about the gender separation, which in addition to helping ensure that there's not some kind of frivolity which might lead to sexual impropriety, there's something about the gender separation that it seems, at least I think this is what Soloveitchik is suggesting, that's also creating or defining the synagogue as a ritual space distinct from the social spaces that we usually inhabit. And I think that's particularly important and interesting point, because often when we talk about things that can be uncomfortable about the mechitza, if those issues often come from a place of, this is so different from how I live the rest of my life. Why should I be separate here or in the back here or above here when ordinarily in my life I am mixed for many of us? Now, of course, this is specific to a certain kind of community. But in effect, I think what he's saying, he's disarming that argument, and he's saying, but that's the point. The point is that it's supposed to feel different. That's part of what makes the synagogue the ritual sacred space. Okay, so Kalat Rosh is something we want to avoid, and we want the separation. And in the Beit HaMikdash, it was a physical separation, not just men and women were separate. And the truth is, historically, we do see things like this. So like the kolbo, but the problem is, again, it's not as explicit. It's sort of like implicit. The kolbo, medieval Rishon, is talking about Tisha B'Av. And he casually mentions how the anashim are in beveit hakneset shelahem, the anashim beveit hakneset shelahem. The men are in their shul, and the women are in their shul. Now, it's not clear if he's talking about a separate room or structure in one building, or if he's actually talking about separate buildings. We know that in some communities in Europe, men and women actually would go to worship, Jewish men and women would actually worship in different buildings. In other communities, they would be in the same building, but there would really be a very strong structural differences. If anyone's ever been to the Altneu Shul in Prague, I'm sure Rabbi Jay has many times, the wall between the men and women section is thick. The first time I went there wasn't during davening. I had a baby with me, and he actually was inside the aperture between the sections because there was room for him to crawl there. It was so thick. It was so wide. It's hard to see. It's hard to hear. And it's clearly built later onto the structure. It's not original to the structure, that space. So we know historically that this often happened. The archaeological evidence is a little bit mixed. There's a lot we can't see from the ruins. We don't know what might have been on the same level. We do know that a lot of ruins of ancient synagogues had pillars which could have supported the load of a second layer, but there's really a lot that we don't know about what there is. And now I have to say that we have the Tzitz Eliezer who's going to try to say, yeah, it's not really there. He puts it on the table. Why isn't it? It's not in the Shulchan Aruch. It's just not there. Because we never had this problem. What problem? Of people asking what was an appropriate mechitza. Because it was obvious that you were going to have a thick wall. Now, I don't know if it was obvious in every place that you would have a thick wall. I think also in a lot of like the Middle Eastern countries, they didn't necessarily even have a women's section, and the women might have been in the courtyard outside the shul and sometimes pop in the shul. But from his perspective, it's obvious how you would do it. And I think what he's saying is, we talked about tradition. I think what he's saying is they knew what to do. That's why. You couldn't talk about the dimensions of the mechitza if the mechitza was obvious. And in his case, what's obvious is you have a thick wall, and it goes from the floor to the ceiling, done. The kolat tefillah yamagia lehem, and the voice of prayer would get to the women. Derech halonot ktanim, and there'd be little apertures, or derech halolim cholim, or little holes even, windows or holes. Shayu asuyim bekoto. V'lo alala dat ki titkayem beklal baya kazot im tzrichim mechitza. Said no one would have ever thought that we would need a Shulchan Aruch justifying having a mechitza because it's so obvious. It's not necessarily the case that everything that's obvious doesn't get talked about in the Shulchan Aruch, but still, it's saying this was really always crystal clear. The Igros Moshe goes even farther. The Igros Moshe says that this is an inyan deoraita. Why does he say that it's a din deoraita? He actually gets it from a Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi, paralleling the Bavli that we saw, when it quotes the pasuk from Zechariah, says that that's a dvar Torah. It's a matter of Torah law, or at least that's how Igrot Moshe understands it. Alma shehu nikra dvar Torah. Therefore, it is understood as a matter of Torah. Even though the pasuk itself is coming from Navi. If it were merely rabbinic, we couldn't have added the balcony. Clearly, there's a din d'oraita that we need a mechitza, says the Igrot Moshe. Rav Yosef Soloveitchik doesn't say that exactly. In his contribution to the volume on the mechitza, the sanctity of the synagogue, he says, biblically, on a Torah level, and he also will take this from Zechariah, we need separation. But to have a physical barrier or height differential, he says, is d'Rabbanan. Okay, so that's a really important machloket. We've seen this basis for the idea that there would be a separation. We've seen that it was so important that it was justifying building a balcony in Beit HaMikdash, but there's a difference of opinion about exactly what that implies. Is it on a Torah level to have a physical separation, or is it with a structure, or is it on a Torah level enough just for men and women to be separated from each other? Okay. Either way, though, Rav Soloveitchik also says, at least rabbinically, you need the physical difference. One last quick point before I take questions. So I see I'm going a little over time, so I'm gonna. Another possibility of what we're worried about is looking. So far, we talked a lot about Kalot Rosh, where Kalot Rosh, it seems like we're trying to prevent the people from intermingling. But, and that's like Rashi, who says, Sarich lavdil anashim minashim lasot gader b'Yisrael shelo yavo lidei kukul. We need to make, as it were, like a fence, a measure to protect so they don't come to do something wrong. It really sounds like we don't want men and women mixing in the setting of, and we'll say in the shul. And that's also the Rambam and Mishnah Torah. When he's talking about Beit HaShoeva, so that they not mix. But interestingly, in its commentary to the Mishnah in Sotah, Rambam says, Makom anashim lamala, al makom ha'anashim gavoa mimenu. The women's place was higher than the men's place. Kedei shelo yistaklu ha'anashim banashim. So that the men not look at the women. So that would be a little different from what we've seen so far. It's also potentially a real difference between the genders. What we saw initially was a concern with intermingling between the genders. What we're seeing now is a concern specifically of men looking at women, presumably because it would lead to some kind of fantasizing or distraction. I'll just throw in one more point before we hold off, before we call it an end for today of the Shir segment. And then next week, Bezrat Hashem will pick it up with these ideas and we'll start applying them to how a mechitza is built. And the one point is just from the Piskei Rid, is just very interesting. Rav Yishaya Ditrani, he says like this. Adayna yubayin l'dei Kalot Rosh. He's still talking about the Gemara about Sukkah. Perush, shayu mistaklin elu ba'elu. They would look at each other, i.e. the men and the women would look at each other. The kortzin beinehen, and they'd wink. Hitkinu shihu anashim ra'ot milamala v'anashim milamata. So that's why they enacted the women would watch Simchat Beit HaShoeva from above and the men from below. Piskei Rid is interesting because he also talks about looking, but he talks about it from a perspective of mutuality. Intermingling is clearly mutual. Both men and women have to be careful not to mingle. If the concern is looking, so one way to phrase the concern about looking is that it's specific to men not looking at women. But an alternate picture, and that's what we saw in Rambam, but an alternate picture to phrase the concern about looking is that men and women can't look or shouldn't be looking during tefillah at each other. Okay, quick summary, and then I'll take some questions. What did we see? We saw Ma'amad Har Sinai, Shirat Hayam, men and women being separate. We saw tefillah is supposed to be a place of kavod rosh, not kalut rosh, and that kalut rosh is associated with men and women intermingling. We saw that in Beit HaMikdash, there was some limitation on intermingling, though not total, and that at Simchat Beit HaShoeva, they actually added a structure to Beit HaMikdash, even though that's usually not allowed, in order to prevent either intermingling per se, or even seeing, where this concern might have been mutual, men and women, or it might have been more one-sided, concern about what the men would do looking at the women. And we also saw that there's a long tradition of having men and women separate in the synagogue and halacha of that. It's not clearly written up in the Shulchan Aruch. It's understood to derive from Beit HaMikdash because the shul is a mikdash ma'at, a temple in miniature. But it's not really well articulated in earlier halachic sources. Okay, that's what we're up to now. Next time, Bezrat Hashem, we'll get into how you build a thing that addresses these goals. But I imagine there's going to be a lot of questions because it's a tricky topic. Okay, well, here we go.
All right. You want me to go through them for you? Or?
Please.
Okay.
Please.
I just going to start, if I may, with Mark Shapiro's comment on when he was in Jerba, talking about the change. And Jerba is the only Arabic Jewish community left in the world. I believe there are 12 shuls. He says there's not anybody, the entire community is all Shomer Shabbos. So he was there, and there are like 11, 12 shuls, and none of them have a mechitza, none of them have a women's section at all. So he asked one of the rabbis, like, what do the women do, Yom Kippur? So he said, the rabbi basically looked at him in the eye and said, what does a woman have to do with going to a shul? In other words, it's just the idea that a woman goes to shul on Yom Kippur. Who ever heard of such an idea? A woman stays at home on Yom Kippur. It's just, again, what we started with, the cultural, sociological difference. And by the way, the Altnai shul, I believe when it was first built in the 1300s, did not have any mechitza. Now they have a 2-foot thick wall with little holes in between it, like where your babies can crawl. But they don't, it is, there wasn't, that's not how people thought. Women didn't go to shul, at least in certain periods. There were other communities, yes. Okay, sorry about that, but let's get to the questions. Okay, Ellen wants to say, maybe we can discuss it, or you can address it now if you want. The separate seating in Chicago. The Chicago is very known to have a traditional shuls, and somebody else asked about what's called a trichitza, where they have the men's section, the women's section, the co-ed section. I know some schools, some community schools do that when they daven. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
So, I mean, I think we'll talk about both of these things a little bit more next time when we're talking about structure, but even so, I'll just say just very quickly that the fact that I think previously there were many more traditional shuls, and my understanding is that most of those shuls have now become fully mixed seating, and that in and of itself might indicate that it's a difficult space to maintain. In other words, even if we were to say, like Rav Soloveitchik, that on a Torah level, the concern is separation, and it's only on a rabbinical level that there be a structural barrier. It seems that if there isn't a physical structural barrier, it might be difficult over time to maintain the separation. So it's a possibility. Tripartite seating is really complicated, right? Because on the one hand, and we'll talk about it more next time, but just to throw out some of the things to think about. On the one hand, it sounds like a way to be able to make a community that will create a space for both more traditional halachically observant Jews and and Jews who want to, and those who want to observe halacha, but might have trouble with this particular halacha and want to have separate seating or what have you. It also, in theory, it could create a space for people who don't fit neatly into the gender binary, right? Which is something that's been coming up more increasingly now in the public space. And at the same time, based on the things that we've been reading, that's not a simple proposition, because if we're talking about defining the space as a sacred space modeled on the Beit HaMikdash, in part by having separation, it's hard to see how you can make room within that for a mix, even if you're yourself are not actively inside the mix. So it's not so simple. Okay.
I will say somebody privately messaged me, but he said I can say that there's whatever in their community, they're having a tehillim for a refuah shlema for a number of people who are sick, and they're inviting men and women. And as I'll quote, since all participants will be muted, since there is no mechitza on Zoom, we respectfully ask that the women turn their video off. So I just find that a fascinating comment. And again, it also raises the question, do you need a mechitza in non-davening environment? But it shows you again the sociological world that we live in. Okay.
That's fascinating. Also, again, back to looking, right? So, and we're going to talk about structure. They're basically creating a mechitza structure by having cameras off, right. And that's voting with the position that the concern is not looking.
I mean, on the same way, you know, I've gotten emails, and not inviting me personally, but you know, I'm on the list. Come to a shiur given by so and so, like woman giving the shiur, but it's only for women. Now, what's to prevent? I haven't gone, but what's to prevent me from going and turning my camera off and pretending I'm a woman? The whole thing is just fascinating. Okay, Susanna says Miriam said lahem, what you sort of alluded to at the beginning, that implies she was talking to the men also. Communal singing, that's a few people. And, you know, the pshat and the psukim seems to be like that. If okay.
So I think that Vatitzena Hanashim, meaning Miriam goes out and the women go out after her with the dancing. So aside from the fact that there really are a lot of Parshanim who deal with the question of the word lahem, but the dancing itself, it's pretty clear that physically the women are following Miriam and they're not with the men. I think that's pshat in the verse, but you can look back at it and you can send me a message later about why you disagree.
Okay, Ellie's pointing out in the 1950s, and yes, this I think was quite common. The shul had a women's balcony, but on Rosh Hashanah, I know a number of shuls like that. Rosh Hashanah, they had too many people; they didn't have a mechitza, so the men, right? I don't know if you right. The men had mixed seating. There was mixed seating in the men's section. I know some shuls just had separate seating without the mechitza. I'm sorry.
It's actually mixed seating on downstairs.
Okay, that was the 1950s was a different world, which might explain why the mechitza became such an issue, because so many Orthodox shuls were not, you know, had mixed seating. It was not uncommon, as we many know. The OU had many shuls that were affiliated Orthodox shuls and had no mechitzas. That was it's a different world. And you had one or two conservative shuls with the mechitza. That's a whole, the Shar Shemaim in Montreal, perhaps the most famous example of a shul with the mechitza. That was officially conservative, but with the mechitza. And it was a very interesting world. Okay, it's Moshe who tells him separate, fine, I'm not sure. Okay, that's true. I think most of the things in the Torah. Susanna pointing out Mamad Har Sinai, the fact that people chose to separate, fine. Saying it's not a good model for a shul, what happened at Har Sinai. You want to comment on that?
I think that's a great question. And that's actually part of what we're getting at, right? One of the things that's complicated here is, what is our model for shul? What makes shul shul? What establishes something as a prayer space? What should we be looking at? And so it's not unreasonable that you would look at Ma'amad Har Sinai as the ultimate connection of Am Yisrael with the presence of God. But it's also, yes, it's plausible that you could say we should have another model, but then you'd have to suggest what that model would be, right?
Okay, somebody asking about where the sick people were, where the kids were at Har Sinai. I don't know if anybody addresses that issue.
They were there.
Says there weren't any sick people. The Medrash says everybody got cured at Har Sinai. That's one of the midrashim. I don't think that's why they say it, but okay. Sharm pointing out that Sharm Shemaim Montreal, which we just mentioned. Right, they had a separate, it was a mechitza for any time, right, and they had USY, which is the Conservative Youth Movement. Correct, it was the Conservative Shul. Okay, went through Kalut Rosh, lack of seriousness. I'm just, many of these I'm seeing.
Okay.
On Simcha Beit HaShuv, men and women danced together in the Azar, which you sort of implied. It was originally, of course, without separate seating and without separate, it was mixed.
I don't think men and women dance together in the Azar. I think if you look at the sources about
Yeah, I'm not saying
Simchat
dance
Torah,
together, or that's what, right, I'm sorry, that's what the comment said, right.
I think in Beit HaShoeva, sorry, I know you were quoting the comment. I think in Beit HaShoeva, Simchat Beit HaShoeva, it was really the Talmidei Chachamim who were dancing, and the entire people were watching. The men weren't dancing either, meaning it was a very specific cadre of the elite were dancing, and everyone was watching them dance. So it was, I don't think it was men and women dancing together.
A very interesting question. I think why, although this only be true in the first Beit HaMikdash, I assume that story of the Mechitza in the second Beit HaMikdash, no? I don't know.
Yeah.
I assume the Gemara is Sukkah. So then this question, why didn't they ask the Urim Bitumim in the temple? Because they didn't have any in the second temple. But it's an interesting question. I know later I did see somebody point out, how can Rav Moshe Feinstein claim it's a biblical mitzvah if clearly for hundreds of years there was no Mechitza in the temple? I don't know if you want to address that.
I mean, so this is where things get really tricky, right? So exactly what does he mean? He is Rav Moshe is reading the Yerushalmi, and the Yerushalmi calls it a Dvar Torah, and he says this can establish it as being a din d'oraita that they have to maintain. Presumably he's saying that previously in Beit HaShoeva, at least, this wasn't an issue, and somehow the regular dealings of the Beit HaMikdash, because women on the whole were not in the Azara unless they needed to be, it was not considered unduly mixed. And in the Ezras Nashim, that was considered, I guess, a little bit outside the bounds of where this law had to apply under regular circumstances. So I think that's how he must be reading it. It's not easy. Someone asked before, is this part of the 613 commandments? So you're not going to find it on one of the lists of the 613 commandments Midoraita. It's not the easiest claim to make, but it is. I do believe that Rav Moshe Feinstein genuinely understood it that way. And even Rav Soloveitchik, Rav Soloveitchik says, yeah, he also seems to accept that there's a Torah level obligation here, just not the structural thing. Does everything that is on a Torah level get counted as one of the 613? Not necessarily. That's his own share. But yes, it's just a little tricky. Then this is really, I was very honest, I laid it out before we even started. It's a case where a lot of what we would expect to find that would help us understand it, we just don't have. So we are connecting the dots, and it's a reasonable way to do it, but it's not as clearly solid, and it seems because tradition played a large role in how this was done.
A couple of people pointing out, it seems to be okay for a man to meander into the women's section, but not the other way around, where the women's section is somehow it's not really part of the shul. We can do what we want, which I think is a bad thing. I don't think that's like a question. How does the halacha allow it? That's not
So it really shouldn't, meaning in theory, a slight meander in either direction, if it's once in a blue moon, should not shake the foundations of anything. If this becomes more than a meander, or is clearly more men going into women's spaces, you have to ask what's going on. It's actually funny. We'll talk about it, I think, more next time. We'll see. When we were talking about, let's say, weddings, where sometimes men go off and they daven at a wedding, and sometimes a woman might feel that she would be interested in davening, but she's not sure if she should feel comfortable doing it because there's no mechitza. So we'll talk more about that next time, but just off the cuff, I'll just even say, well, hold on a minute. The mechitza is not just for the women, the mechitza is for the men. The men who are going and davening at the wedding and making a minyan, when the women are sitting there talking, it's not any better than if the women were sitting there davening, right? In other words, it's like an interesting question with all of this is there's the conceptual issue, which is we want to prevent mingling and we want to prevent looking, and we have to balance those things. And we want to create a certain tone. And then there's the kind of this whole, there's tradition, and then there's also almost a sociological aspect of, well, how is this experienced? How do we inhabit that halacha? And that's something that we need to look at some more, or maybe, and that's also a place where we can do some rethinking. What would it mean if men at a wedding would, before they started davening, set up an area for women to daven? Or how is it experienced differently if the impromptu minyan happens in the middle of the room or in the side of the room? What are the spaces? What happens to a space when people will start davening in it? And how does that affect all of us, men and women? There's a lot to think about.
Yeah, Laurie, I'm not sure if you're going to mention the tshuva of Rav Moshe in volume 8 about how it's okay to have a shul where two women daven without a mechitza. Just consider.
We'll talk.
Okay, I'm not sure if you're going to raise it. We'll get to that next week. Okay, good. I'm sorry. Okay, as the Rav would have it, Rav Soloveitchik, barriers around us would help individual communion with the divine. I believe, Ellen, the Rav commented, if I'm not mistaken, that the minhag in his family is that children did not daven with their fathers either. This idea that you're alone before God is not only a man-woman idea, it's a man-man idea. And I have to check it, but I seem to recall the Rav once saying in a shiur that even the kids didn't daven with their fathers. They should know you stand alone before God. So I think he would, yes, want barriers all around us to be alone, but before God. Yeah. Okay. Somebody raising question to you, you're going to raise that next week. They can't see what's on the men's section. That's for next week's shiur, how the size of the mechitza, what the mechitza, where the mechitza, that we'll discuss next week. Okay. Dedications, there's no dedications, Susanna points out, for the Ezrat Nashim. In ancient synagogues, looks like they daven together, or could be no woman came to shul. See, when you find a shul without a mechitza, either means there was no mechitza, either men and women daven together, or it means women didn't go to shul. So I don't know.
There's a lot of speculation and a lot that's unknown.
Right.
That's just the honest truth. There's a lot we don't know, and it wasn't written.
Somebody just pointing out, I don't know, I assume they mean every, I'm sure a little seriousness. If shul is a place for change, then it should be the men who take care of the kids in shul and the families and change the diapers and etc. Okay.
Well, so that's also a question: is what kind of change? In what way should shul be different from other spaces?
Yeah. Okay.
That gets into what you were saying. Also, like children at all. Do children belong in synagogue? Right. It's a big question.
I mean, I know Rav Schechter told us many times that you're not allowed to bring a baby in diapers to shul because if the baby he defecates, it's inappropriate to go to the washroom in the shul. That's not can't have. You have to make sure only clean children to be in shul. But okay, somebody asked you the title of the book you mentioned, Community, Covenant, and Commitment, Selected Letters and Commentaries, Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik. The Torah Harav, I think that's what the foundation called. After the Rav passed away, there are about 10, 11 volumes. They're fantastic volumes. The Rav left hundreds and thousands of pages of writing that were never published. And they worked together, groups of people to publish them on Tefillah. That was the first one, and mourning, all kinds of subjects. So Snadi help God. We'll be giving our Parsha Shir in a couple of weeks. He was, tasked with doing all the letters of the Rav. So we went through many of the letters. This was with Tova Lichtenstein and Atara Chorsky, the two daughters of the Rav, working together, I believe David Schatz, a whole team. So all the books are fascinating. But I was talking to Laurie earlier today, and we were talking about the letters the Rav wrote on the Mechitza. I mean, Laurie mentioned the second half, the first half, the Rav, the way he praises the conservative rabbi, how wonderful he is and the wonderful work he does for the community. It's sort of such an amazing letter. Nonetheless, I can't go into the shul to honor him, on this occasion. So anyways, Community, Covenant, and Commitment, I highly recommend all of the books, if I can say. Okay, so that was asking. Okay, people can wink at a distance. All right, that's if they want to. Can you address the need for separation? COVID shuls, outside shuls. That's sort of at the wedding. It's the same issue. Do you need a mechitza anywhere outside of a shul? A shiva house. I'm sure many of you have been to a shiva home, very frum, quote unquote, and yet the women are, there's no mechitza, and women are davening there. The daughter wants to daven and whatever. So, Laurie, I assume you'll address all of that, next week. Okay. Let's see. I see tons of questions coming in. Is the obligation to be separate on men, not on women? You kind of alluded to that already. You'll pick up on that.
Yeah, but I mean, basically, if we're talking about mingling, it's pretty clear that it's on everybody, right? Mingling is an issue, is mutual.
Yeah.
If it were just about looking and just about men looking, that would be different. But it seems pretty prevalent in most of the sources. It's about mingling also, and looking could be bi-directional, so women are in.
Yeah. The demise of the traditional shuls is a larger issue for sure. Some became Orthodox, some conservative. The truth of the matter, there's a trend today, if I can say that, of conservative shuls becoming Orthodox. I have somebody I learned within yeshivas. I don't want to mention, I'm sure many of you have heard of him. He is a prominent rabbi today. He started in the basement of an Orthodox meeting in the basement of the conservative shul, and the conservative shul basically died and they took over, and now they're upstairs. And this is not an uncommon thing. Whereas in the 50s, shuls moved Orthodox and conservative one after the other, like dominoes. Now it's not quite the same, but it is moving the other direction too, which is interesting. Okay. Some of them prayer writing in Israel said recently she thought that after balcony minyanim, a lot of people would be reluctant to go back to the mechitza. Interesting comment by Ellen. Okay, a lot of things are going to be interesting, but are people going to be willing to have a 4-hour davening on Rosh Hashanah after having a 2-hour davening? Going to be lots of interesting things we don't know yet. Okay, making a mechitza. I didn't get to read any of these before because they're just coming in. Into a tri-chitza, either step more tradition, step less tradition. Of course. And I mean, the tri-chitzas that I'm talking about, I think they work well in a community school, which by definition wants kids from all backgrounds. It's different, but I agree with Laurie. It's a very complex issue because the Rav would say it's not in keeping with the shul. I make them really happy, but yes. This
is the kind of thing that, there's certain issues that you can't give a clear answer for across the board. That the accommodation of the halachic complexity and the needs on the ground can make a difference. I'll give you an example. I think in colleges, it's much more frequent for there to be spaces, at least for certain events, let's say Simchat Torah or that kind of thing. There's much more frequent for accommodations to be made for a mixed group and separate groups, that the same Rabbanim who accept that in a college setting would often not accept that in any other setting. And it's because of their understanding of what's going on there. So, some of this, it's not just cut and dry halacha, really. So you can't even give advice across the board because it's so specific.
All of halacha is like that. That's why you need a personal rabbi to ask questions. A lot of things you say, there are always exceptions to the halacha is much more pliant, if I can use that word, or flexible than people might realize, and much more attuned to the individual. Certain things, of course, are etched in stone, but it's often you have to ask. Okay, what was about the 50s, greater leniency? The 50s, it was a different world, what can I tell you? Laurie, you want to comment?
There's just also, this was the moment of, Donna Reed, the classic nuclear family showing up together was, and the move to the suburbs and wanting to emulate kind of the WASP church going model in some ways, even if, and from a very Jewish perspective, even if subconsciously, the sense that this is a moment of family togetherness going to show, which there's a lot to be said for that in its own way. There really is. It's not a crazy idea, but I think there was a big premium at that time being put on the nuclear family being presented together in public that kind of affected what people were looking for in their synagogues. Okay. But even there, it's a part of it. Also, I should just also clarify is there were denominational tensions, and there was really it was still not clear what Judaism in America was going to look like. And on some level, one of the reasons why conservative Judaism was so successful in that particular era was because they sold themselves on some level as saying, this is the Judaism of America's future. And part of the Judaism of America's future was, yes, and we have the father and mother's, like it was a package of suburban life integrated into the classic shul setting. And that was something that was still being discovered how it would work. And kind of the conservative movement got there first in terms of imagining what would appeal to that generation, and that helped create a lot of the tensions, I think.
Okay, Alan, pointing out what you've already mentioned, the time projection, when did the Mechitza start? Maybe we can pick up again that week. Again, like you said, not so simple. Sephardics, yeah, many societies are still very gender separated, as I mentioned earlier about the Hillam thing tonight, etc. If a woman entered the men's shul, it would be scandalous. That's not necessarily halachically true. I mean, I didn't want to raise the issue, but at some point, believe me, a shul, I've said it many times and I'll say it, I'm happy to say it again in public, a shul where men talk throughout davening is, believe me, a lot worse, where the men and women sit together. It impinges worse on the Kedushat Beit Knesset, where people are talking through Kriyas Torah, Chazar, Hashatz, and the men and women sitting quietly together. But that's, I don't know if you want to go there, but the fact what people consider scandalous was why it's accepted for certain things and not others, that's a whole other subject. I don't know if you want to comment on.
Well, I think that also there's different settings. So when you have a clear women's section, I think there's a sense that it would be more scandalous somehow for the woman to enter the male space than for the man to enter the female space, which is interesting. If you didn't have a women's section, and let's say a woman needed to come in to say Birkat Gomel or something like that, I think there's a history of that happening, or there being a courtyard area, which would have been a neutral or a threshold space, a near the door area, where a woman might have called out or responded when there was a ritual reason for it. That would probably have been experienced a little bit differently. So again, we're back to the same problem. It's really hard from our position to understand the workings of how these things, of how it went. There's a lot of speculation, and we don't fully know, but things that are obvious to us that are, are pasnish could never be, something like that. It's possible then in some communities that could have worked in a moment to moment level, not on a, every day or for a full tefillah. So it's just hard to say.
There was a time and a place, and still is, if a rabbi spoke in the vernacular, that was considered the sign of non-orthodoxy. What things become accepted and what things don't. I mean, I'm just, in Hungary, that's Azriel Hildesheimer had to leave Hungary to go to Germany to establish the seminary because he was considered not Orthodox. I mean, you speak in Hungarian or German in the shul. That was one of the 1869 decrees in the Hungarian shul. If any rabbi spoke in the vernacular, that you weren't allowed to daven in such a shul. Obviously, that did not carry the day, at least not in anybody who's on this Zoom shir in our world, for sure not carry the day. So you're right, there's a lot of sociological things. Okay, somebody women, okay, when I was davening outside, yes, I don't think any of these outside minyanim had a mechitza. There were women who came to some of them. I'm not aware of any that had.
I am. It's just interesting. I am, yeah.
Okay,
cool. It's also, meaning it's fascinating also to see the ways in which, like, I know of one woman, there's a set minyan on one side of the street. Okay, it's here in Efrat. And I know of someone who on a regular basis davens in the bus stop across the street from this minyan. But I also know, because and I'm giggling, but I shouldn't be giggling. I actually have a lot of respect for it. This is what she feels is a respectable mechitza type space. I know of people who have set up minyanim in playgrounds, and there's another level of street above the playground, and women congregate there. And I know of some street minyanim where they actually have set up mechitza. So there's such an unbelievably wide range of what's been going on right now with COVID. Yes, I hope that when we get into the structure, we're going to understand better what that's all about.
Okay, I think we're basically wrapping up. The family that prays together stays together. That was the motto in the sense of the conservative movement, correct? I don't know if it's actually true at all, but whatever. Okay. The Shiva houses with the mechitza, how does a woman be menachem av to men? I think in those homes it would say a woman should not be menachem av to a home, to a man. That's what they say. That's you're going to Shiva homes. You see that. I've seen that on occasion. You know, you never used to see it. But anyways, Laurie, thank you very much. I hope you don't mind. I know the back and forth and the comments. This is really such a sociological issue. I think more than any of the other issues we've done today. It's less halakha and more, and the halakha is not clear since there's nowhere in the Rambam or the Shulchan Aruch. How big is a mechitza? It's all like, you know, there's a lot of flexibility. And
well, we'll get into that. We'll get into the structure next time. But yeah, I'm glad. I'm grateful to all of you for being so engaged. And Bezrat Hashem, you know, we'll continue to look at this, you know, honestly and with reverence, and we're doing our best. But it's hard when a lot of the information is we just don't have.